You were a drummer for 25 years and traveled all over Europe with your band. You had this physical and mental pain that was holding you back and causing you a lot of stress. How did the Alexander technique change your life and what doors did it open for you?
Well, the Alexander technique, brother, taught me to stop causing myself all of that pain in the way that I was doing the things that I was doing. So it was actually a chiropractor who recommended me to get into that work. And the reason that she made that recommendation is because she found no pathology in my spine. There was nothing wrong with my spine. There was nothing wrong with my body on the whole. I actually had a healthy system. It was the way that I was using it that was the problem. And that made me a perfect candidate for Alexander Technique. So the Alexander Technique teachers that I worked with, of which there were dozens, it's an amazing community. The organization is called the Interactive Teaching Method. They're based here in England, but they have teachers all over the world. They taught me slowly, gradually, how to stop doing a bunch of stuff that was causing me all that trouble, which was essentially just tension. I was tense. I was doing a bunch of unnecessary stuff, most pronounced when I was playing the drums, but also in other activities that I was doing as well. So it was a slow process of learning to let go of that extra effort that I was putting into the things that I was doing for all kinds of erroneous reasons.
Was there any kind of mental implications there? Like, were there things that you were tensing up because of the way you were thinking, or was it mostly because of the physical things you were doing, like when you were on tour and playing your kit?
Yeah, it's all mental in the end. It's interesting. There's actually a huge rift in the Alexander Technique community. The organization that I trained with is not the only organization, but I lucked out because they're the ones who take Alexander's work to be about mental discipline. And that suited me just fine. I was doing my mindfulness alongside as well. I've always been uh, quite a mind centered dude. So it suited me straight off the bat. And it was precisely the cultivation of mental discipline, specifically in learning to inhibit those habitual behaviors that I had come to experience as normal, even part of my identity. There was just some muscular tension going on there in my upper back that I think was probably constantly on. Like I would wake up from sleep and I would be tense, really tense. Didn't know before someone told me that because over the years of playing drums and calcifying these erroneous notions about how to move, how to be, how to hold myself, they'd become normal. So until I got that outside opinion, I didn't even know that there was anything wrong. Hence, I ended up with the chiropractor first and then was shocked when she told me there's nothing wrong with you. And this is a very common story among people who find their way to Alexander Technique lessons. They've usually tried everything else. They've tried all the fixes, and then finally all that's left, and this is the hypothesis that Alexander himself gave to his doctor, all that's left is the possibility that we ourselves are doing something that's causing the pain, the discomfort, the issue.
And that's such a universal problem. When you think, you store these like emotions, and the chemicals that get released from your brain quite literally create your body. And you can, whether you call it manifestation or, law of attraction or whatever, like you store these things in your shoulders, in your hips. I remember the first time I ever did hot yoga, dude. I went into half pigeon, and it's this hip opening position. And my lip just started trembling. Like it was like borderline on tears. And I didn't have anything running through my mind. Like there was nothing that was making that happen other than there was like a release of some sort of contained emotion or thought process or something that I had housed there. And the first four times I did that position, that happened to me until I eventually loosened up and must have let some of that go. So I can imagine, like, and I get it in my back, my shoulders. I think we all experience some of that. It's a combination of how we're living. In your case, it was playing drums. You know, a lot of creators were sitting in front of our laptops or we're hunched over on our phones. And then you combine that with some sort of maybe negative thought process or some unawareness in your thoughts. and that can be pretty dangerous from a physical standpoint. So it's important that we take control of our minds. And obviously, you're a mindfulness coach now. There's a huge umbrella of topics that fall underneath mindfulness. I'm curious, how do you decide what things you talk about, what areas you focus on when you're creating all of your content?
Mm. When I'm creating, I try to go broad. Certainly on social platforms, I'm thinking about what can I use to introduce as many people as possible to mindfulness, or even more broadly than that. Actually, just most recently, I'm thinking about maybe I don't even want to use the word mindfulness so much. Maybe I want to talk about happiness, productivity, these even bigger buckets that everyone can relate to. And then later on, perhaps in my newsletter, perhaps on a call, then if mindfulness is the appropriate solution for an individual, then we could talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness is certainly what worked for me. I've seen it work for hundreds of others. I think it's incredibly potent. I've also seen people get amazing results in their lives without using mindfulness. So I'm interested in how can I talk about benefits first and then work with someone, given that there's so much availability for different ways of tackling problems these days. I'm interested in kind of diagnosing someone, I suppose, by the time we get onto a call, or sometimes someone will shoot me back an email from a newsletter issue where I'll tend to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more specific. And it may be that the appropriate thing to do is to recommend someone else's service, you know. If someone's bottleneck is something more in the area of, say, systemizing productivity, well, that's not my area, so I might send them to someone else. But then when someone begins actually working with me, then I'll begin a real process of diagnosis, and we can get into that, certainly, if it's somewhere that you want to go.
It's kind of like your chiropractor. She was like, I figured out that
Yeah,
maybe someone else can serve you better. And that's,
yeah.
says a lot about you as a coach and as someone who wants the best for people. Have you found that more and more people with regards to the word mindfulness, do you think people are opening up more to this idea that it's not so woo woo and it's actually very practical?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. When I began my mindfulness journey in 2015, 2016, I would get funny looks from people when I mentioned it. I learned quite quickly, in fact, to not mention it to most folks. But the conversation has changed so much since then. Now, not only do most people know what it is and know that it's not something woo woo, but actually, most people know that it's something good. So the conversation has changed greatly. Yeah, I'm pleased to see it.
You said that the most profound spiritual instruction that you found was from a Tibetan teaching called Dzogchen, and that is rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. And I'm wondering if you found that entering that state of no mind has helped you unlock your direction and your purpose, particularly when it comes to creating.
Almost unbelievably so, brother. Yeah, yeah. I remain impressed by the potency of that simple instruction.
There's a real freedom, I think, in releasing yourself from your thoughts from without labeling. That was something I learned from Eckhart Tolle. Is kind of, when he went through his massive shift, he was very depressed. He was laying in bed one night and he said, "I cannot live with myself any longer. I cannot live with myself any longer." And he realized that there were these two beings, the I and the myself, and how is there this separation? And he got sucked into this like light, kind of like a black hole, but like a light hole. And then he woke up and everything was just pure bliss. And he sat on a park bench for like 4 months and just did nothing but just sit and watch and just be in bliss. And part of his teaching is around not labeling things. And I think that's a really powerful way to become present in any moment, is to look around the room and you have so many, you don't realize until you intentionally do it, where you have so many labels and associations with things around you that just by trying to be and to just observe, your mind's going at 100 miles an hour because you're saying, oh, that's a lamp. Oh, there's the creatine. Oh, I didn't go to the gym today. Oh, like you're just like looking at every single thing and you have an association with it. Um, and I found the same thing that with my creativity, it's like if you can just stop and relax and not label, but look at something just for what it is physically, all of a sudden there's something from a deeper source that comes through you and starts to give you ideas.
Mm. You remind me of one of my favorite quotes from a wonderful teacher named Ram Dass, who you're probably familiar with too. He said, the problem with thinking is we always think about things. So we're always one thought away from reality. We're in the realm of contrivance, fabrication. Language is invented. Now, sure, it's interesting, right? It began as grunts, but it's evolved into this very cerebral thing. We can tell ourselves all these complex stories about things. For example, your example of looking at the creatine and then kicking yourself for not being at the gym today is classic, right? So common. It can go so much further than that, right? It can spin out into, I didn't go to the gym today. I suck. I never keep up with the things that I say I'm going to do. Why am I like this? Well, it's probably because when I was a child, my father treated me this way and that way. And before we know it, we're just lost in intellectual speculation, so far removed from what's actually going on in the moment. And what's fascinating about this to me is that's only making it harder for us to actually turn around and go to the gym. We're more likely to actually go to the gym when we're in that relaxed state of not trying to bully ourselves to go to the gym. The more I see, the more I confirm that any kind of cracking the whip on ourselves is a limited time offer. It might get things done for a while, but it's a limited time offer. I've never seen it lead to real consistency for people. Or in the rare case that it does, we're talking about individuals who are so shut down emotionally that we wouldn't want to trade places with them.
It brings me to a quote of yours. And you said, the less we do what we think we should do or be how we think we should be, that's exactly where our genuine self is to be found. And there's a lot of people right now, content creators in particular, that are trying to find their niche and try to figure out what they want to talk about and who they are in this digital world. Are there specific practices that you can recommend that people can do less or to think less that help them tap into that creativity and that self awareness?
Well, first and foremost, rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. Right. But what I find is that's where I begin with every student that I see these days. And in a sense, what I'm doing is, in a sense, beginning at the end, beginning at that most profound and simple instruction. And then what my job is to see, where can my student not rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. And if that student says to me, well, look, when I try to create content, Dan, I'm caught up in thinking about what I should write, what are people going to like. I look at my post history and I see I'm not getting the engagement I want, etc., etc. Then we might work together to devise a practice for that individual. And it might look something like openupx.com, be there, ready to write, and just watch the mind. Maybe even have a journal open in another tab and write down what the mind is throwing up. And now we've got something to examine. Maybe they bring that journal entry back to our next session and we take a look. And then what we can do is we can start to deconstruct, disprove even some of that mental dialogue that's going on. For example, my writing isn't good enough. Well, the first question I would have for someone who brings that to me is, by whose standard? Who is the arbiter of writing quality for Twitter, for X, right? And where are they? And if you can find one, Let's take a look. Let's see if we can learn something, right? So immediately we're opening the whole thing up. We're saying if there's no standard to be found, then go ahead and write. It's almost like a flowchart I'm seeing in my head here, right? If there's no standard, go ahead and write. If there is a standard, let's find out where that is and get more information on it and learn, and then improve your writing in that way, right? So there's always a solution. Whatever the mind throws up, there's always a way to simplify it, make a solution. And of course, what we're doing really, what my goal is with that student is to walk it back to the simplest position possible. Now, it's interesting thinking about content creation because, of course, there are certain things that we can do to make our writing more appealing to other people. If, for example, we were to just publish our journal entries, very few people are going to be interested in that. We're not thinking about the reader, we're not packaging our thoughts for the reader. So there is a craft to be learned here. The question is, can we learn that craft without thinking that we're having to do it because we suck? Rather, it's beginning from the position, my thoughts have value, my knowledge and expertise has value. What I need to do now is package it up for the attention marketplace and then send it out.
Exploring what's going on in your brain, what's actually popping up as you sit down to find creativity or think about what to write. It reminds me of an exercise that I heard about, which is kind of similar to what you said, but it was sit down and write down words, single words that pop into your brain, and just write them, like elephant, banana, like whatever's just popping in your brain. And then eventually you'll find one, like pretty quickly, I think, where there's actually something there. You're like, actually, I have thoughts about that right now. I just wrote a tweet about dogs, and it kind of triggered a lot of people because it was mostly saying that dogs are a net negative for a lot of people. And that just came about by me like exploring just something I'm actually thinking about rather than like trying to fish and find things and force it. And so you do have to look inward and find that inspiration, but it's also really important to look at what other people are doing or to listen to other people's ideas and get inspiration there. And I know Alan Watts was a huge inspiration for you and bridged you into your spirituality journey. I'm curious, who are some of the people that brought you into your Twitter journey, inspired you in those early days of being a creator?
Mm. So I can give you a little timeline actually. First of all, I met a friend who's been somewhat absent recently called Nova Richards. She and I met very early on in my journey. I think she was beginning a second account at that point, so she had a little more experience than I. She introduced me to a group that Rob Lennon was running at the time. And that got me connected with a bunch of friends who were taking it really quite seriously, really thinking about how to construct a tweet, how to construct a thread, how to get people onto your newsletter, etc., how to get as much value as possible into all of those formats. And so I was hooked. At various times in my life, I've really thrived on having a craft to try to perfect. And in that community of Rob Lennons, I really felt like I was surrounded by folks who were taking it seriously. I was very keen. From there, I met Clint Murphy, and Clint was kind enough to do a couple of Twitter spaces with me. That was wonderful. And then I met Dan Koe, and Dan has been the single most influential mentor in this journey of mine. I got into his digital economics cohort. Vertical learning curves everywhere. I'm learning about writing, I'm learning about marketing, I'm learning about funnels, newsletter, the whole picture, the broadest picture. That curriculum, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but that digital economics curriculum is incredibly dense, incredibly thorough. So I still feel I could go through that curriculum 6, 10, 15 more times and learn stuff. I'm fortunate enough now to be working with Dan inside his new mastermind, helping out some of the beginners in there. And so that's been the shape of my journey, and I'm enormously grateful to all of these influential creators who have been out and forged the path so that I could follow.
Yeah, it's really important to find those people that you look up to, that you can learn from, those people that are 2, 3 years ahead of you, that are where you want to be. And you're working further with Dan on Cortex now, is that right?
That's
And
right.
I don't, I know a lot of it's still under wraps, but are you able to share kind of what you've been able to contribute to that project and how that's helped you grow?
Yeah, I want to tread carefully. I know that it's public knowledge that Dan is developing a piece of software called Cortex. And I know that he's been, I think, just in his newsletter, offering people spots in a mastermind program, which is around the whole creator game. And inside that mastermind, I'm really just looking for opportunities to help people. I've filmed one video training inside on Midjourney. I've received a lot of questions from folks on the images that I create with Midjourney, which I managed to kind of uh, twist into a consistent kind of branded style, which I think is quite valuable for us. So I've always received lots of questions about that. So that was something that I was keen to contribute. So really just turning around and paying it forward, all of this wonderful stuff that I've learned over this past 18 months, and being able to give that back inside of a focused community where I'm not too overwhelmed. I can take my time with questions, and I'm learning probably more than the participants, to be honest. There's that whole proverbial kind of sense that the teacher is in the best position to learn, right? So as I turn around and begin to teach some of this stuff now, it's calcifying it all in my own mind much more quickly, I think, than it would if I were just continuing on my solo journey.
There's without question incredible benefits from teaching because you're forced to put things into a digestible way, which forces you to then really dial in on what you actually think and how you actually operate and put into a system. And then you find efficiencies and optimizations in your own process just by having to go through the exercise of outlining it and being ready to teach it. And you fill in your own gaps by helping others. And then you get that positive reinforcement. And it's amazing. I've learned that myself over the past couple of years becoming a creator. And you have all these people around you that are supporting you and helping you learn. And I know your wife has also had a massive influence on you. You always talk about her, and even in your ex profile it says, I married a hot psychologist. She's like part of your brand, actually, right in the forefront. What role has she played for you in your growth as a person, as a creator? And do you think that it's important for people to have a partner in their journey when they're going out and putting themselves out there, putting their thoughts out there, and having that like feedback loop in the home? Does that help putting the messages out into the wild?
Mm. She has helped me tremendously. However, I would say it this way: if you can find the right partner, then absolutely begin an interdependent relationship where you're both supporting one another in symbiosis. But I think that's incredibly hard to find. I think it's incredibly rare to find someone with whom the result is a net benefit to both partners. People are so extraordinarily complex that often when you put two of them together, they're worse off than they would have been alone. And even with the best will in the world, that's often the case. And it's sad. And I think this really has its roots in how we're all raised and how we're educated. If we were taught more about well-being at a young age, I think we'd all have better relationships. But Debbie's influence on me has been profound. When we met, she had just arrived in the UK from India. And in India, she'd been studying psychology, whilst here in the UK, I'd been studying Buddhism. So we had this weird kind of crossed paths situation going on. And our first date really was just about comparing notes. We were just fascinated to meet, even if it were only to become a friendship. It was so interesting to us that she'd been in the land of Buddhism studying psychology, and I'd been more where the kind of academic version of the study of the mind hails from. And And yet here I was studying the Eastern philosophies. So we really wanted to have that conversation. And that conversation actually played out probably over the following 2 years. We just delighted in sharing our understandings with one another until we reached such a degree of understanding of one another that really our understandings had fused beyond a certain point. So it's interesting, actually, I share very little of what I'm up to these days with her. Every now and then, if I have a piece that I'm particularly either proud of or just that I think will be interesting to her, then I'll show her. Maybe I'll fact check something with her. But to be honest, if I want to find a study on something, I can just go to GPT.
You said that sometimes you show your wife some of your content if you want to fact check something or if you just are proud of it. Does she follow you on X? Does she follow your newsletter?
She is following me, but actually, she doesn't spend a lot of time on X. She's quite removed from it all. We've spoken about her beginning a brand of her own. I think she'd have a ton of value to offer given her academic background. That's something that's often kind of lacking actually in our corner of X. We don't see many academics. When I see someone with psych degree in their bio, I'm always like, "Oh, okay, let's see what this person's got to say." So I think there's a lot for her to offer. But she's not really following the game right now. She is working so hard in her own role, working as a psychologist, that, to be honest, when she comes home, is the last thing she wants to think about.
Yep, I hear that. What's interesting to me about you, or one of many things, is that you have this great relationship with your wife, but for a long time, you've spoken about you had a fear of intimacy for almost 30 years, feeling unworthy of affection, and mostly from a romantic sense, but I'm sure that also bleeds over into other areas of your life. Has it been a huge shift for you from feeling like an imposter in your own relationships to building a brand where people outwardly are loving you all the time?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Though I would say it's definitely been a case of becoming that person first and then seeing it manifest outwardly. I'm a real big fan of that line from Stephen Covey: private victories must precede public victories. There's definitely been a theme in my journey, and it was definitely the case that I learned to give love to myself before, first of all, I met Debbie and found that love from her, and then came online and started interacting with people out here. Yeah.
That's a quick growth path from feeling like you don't deserve intimacy to almost immediately finding your wife after that, to then going online and sharing and giving and receiving love in the most scaled way humans have ever found, to this point, to globally be recognized for your ideas and for your contributions. And a lot of what's holding people back from doing stuff like that is in their head. Of course, it's a lot of the thoughts, the stories that they tell themselves that stem from ego, is one of the places. And one mantra that you use often is when you're talking to yourself, you say, "Thank you for trying to protect me, ego, but I don't need you right now." Right. And you can set that aside. Do you believe ego is the enemy? Or are there ways that we can use it, particularly in understanding other people and capturing their attention to create and to inspire?
It's a very interesting question, brother, and really I'm going to have to think it through on the fly with you, and here's why: is I don't spend a lot of time talking about ego. When we talk about an ego, and it's interesting because I'm always thinking about levels, right? We speak at different levels. But the reason that I don't speak about ego often is rooted in the level of direct experience, which I would call, in working with a student, the ultimate level of what's true. The ultimate level of reality is what's happening right now, and how is it exactly in your direct experience. Well, in that direct experience of the present moment, there can be no ego. An ego is dependent upon past and, I suppose, future, depending on how you might think about it, probably more often past. And it's a construct. in a sense. It's a group of characteristics. It's who we think we are over time. It's a pretty clean definition, I would say. I'm quite happy with that. I'm sure there'll be folks in the audience who define it differently, but I'm quite happy with that as a definition, that the ego is who we think we are over time. Well, in a single moment, that time doesn't exist, and so the ego can't exist. And so, as long as we talk about an ego and give it power, then we're in a sense trapped by any of the negative characteristics of that ego. And we might find ourselves acting consistently with how we've thought about ourselves in the past. And that's the whole trap, right? So that would be, I suppose, leaning towards the side of the argument that would call the ego the enemy. Now, can the ego ever be our friend, as it is, as we take it to be? I think so. I think that things like anger that appear to be born from the ego, right? I've been wronged, for example. That is a kind of fuel, and it can be a potent fuel. You know, one way that we might look at things is we could take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And in that hierarchy of needs, well, anger can be useful for moving from one level of need to the next. And then at some point, we're going to want to ditch anger. And inside that model, we could say, well, in the end, to get to self-actualization, maybe we want to ditch ego altogether. So you can hear how many different levels we can talk about at once here, and how they even kind of interweave. So it's quite a difficult subject to approach, but I think the answer would be both and neither. My recommendation to anyone is to just let go of any appearance of an ego in any moment that it arises, to treat it no differently to the weather.
It's so interesting because humans evolve with the things that they need in order to survive. And so, if we have something at our disposal that's so deeply wired into us from a biological standpoint, or I don't even know if it's biology, but there's something that it's deep within us, and that means to me that there's probably some purpose for it. And I also think that it's difficult to assume or expect that we can ever rid ourselves of it. And so it's more about how can we use it or how can we dismiss it. And like you say, it's kind of both. It's like, how do we, when it's there, how can we channel it? And because when it's there to serve us, and when it's there to distract us, how can we dismiss it? And it's more of like the awareness of deciding whether or not it's coming up at a time that's useful or not, rather than deciding that we don't want it. Because really nobody walks around without ego. I think that my little running theory is that there's always one person on earth who is enlightened or free of ego. And that was probably Jesus. That was probably the Buddha. And now I personally think it's Eckhart Tolle. If you ever just listen to that man speak, it's just he's floating on something else. Um, my audience is probably sick of me talking about him, but he's been a big influence for me. And we have to take control of our thoughts and recognize them in order to find happiness, which you've talked about is maybe even pivoting your brand towards that. You've spoken about how in 2017 your mother attempted suicide, and effectively she became your first student, your first mindfulness student, as you worked with her to kind of get her mental health back on track. And your coach at the time then told you, hey, like you've done such a good job with her, and that must have been so difficult and so intense. You're ready to now go out and teach others. And that was the beginning of your coaching journey. And I'm curious, what have you learned about yourself over the last few years in your journey as a coach?
Honestly, not much. And I think the reason why is, first of all, the potency of the practice that took me to that point of readiness to teach. Bearing in mind, there was a period after teaching my mother, I was actually reluctant to go ahead and teach other people, first of all, what I wanted to do was go and cross-reference my understanding of mindfulness and everything around it with other teachers. So I had that first teacher of mine, and then I went and explored other presentations of Dharma. That was deeply educational. I have also been teaching for over 20 years at this point. So although the subject was different, I was teaching music previously, teaching drums, the skill of teaching was pretty well established. So actually, in terms of, if I were to think about writing, like, what have I learned about myself as a coach over the past few years, not much would come up, actually. Not much would come up. It feels pretty stable.
That's so interesting that it's really the practice itself that has done most of the work and most of the awareness. You haven't, have you ever come across like somebody else's problem that you've recognized in them that you've thought, hey, maybe that's something I'm dealing with too?
No, no, it's not happened. Not for a long time. And I think there's something to be said for, the folks who teach this stuff take it real seriously. And I took it very seriously too, that recommendation from my first teacher being not only a great honor, but also I felt very keenly the weight of responsibility that is on one who teaches this stuff, because people will bring everything. People will bring their most vulnerable stuff. They're completely open and completely vulnerable a lot of the time when they come to this practice. So I really, really wanted to be ready. I really wanted to feel like I've handed off my emotional baggage so that I can help other people with theirs. So no, I can't tell you a moment since teaching my mother that a student came to me with a problem that I felt that I was facing myself.
Some people think that mindfulness is very much in the spiritual realm. And we talked a little bit about how it's very practical. But some people just want to hear about, like, how do I make money? That's all they care about, or that's really what's on the forefront. And that's kind of like, it seems, a result of maybe getting your mind in order. I heard you say that the degree to which my mindfulness has increased is the degree to which my bank account has increased. What's the relationship between mindfulness and money?
Mutual benefit. When we relax through the practice of mindfulness, we find that mutual benefit is our nature. We naturally incline toward mutually beneficial activities. There's nothing else to do in the end. We're just going to do good stuff because it feels good to do good stuff. It's our nature. And in an ethical business, which I would argue every creator business must be, mutual benefit is the name of the game. So they go together beautifully. And I found an incredible compatibility there, whereby really this whole business venture is just the extension of that practice that I've done over the past decade or so.
Is there an intentionality or a prayer or a manifestation? Is there anything that you do to kind of work with money as an energy as it relates to mindfulness? Or is it just that becoming more centered eventually aligns you with abundance?
Yeah, the latter. Yeah. Um, to me, it became obvious that it was a good idea to share about this stuff. And in sharing about this stuff, I've been able to provide value to people. And of course, when we provide value to people, they give us money. And the money thing was an interesting subject for me for a long time, brother. That first teacher of mine is a good Theravadin. He expressly forbade the changing hands of fees, even related to mindfulness practice. And there's a certain kind of merit in that, in a culture of generosity, like what we see in Eastern cultures. I had to come to terms with the fact that we don't live in that kind of culture. In fact, even in the East, that kind of culture is dying. In our culture, we do stuff for fees. That's how we've arranged for business to continue. It's convenient for everyone. Money is a store of value. And so, stripping money back to its most fundamental characteristic, it's a store of value. Then I've found that all I need to do is get up in the morning and give, and then I receive. So, yeah, abundance.
You have a tweet that says 99% of people you've known won't attend your funeral. Do what you want with your life. So I'm curious, what are you doing with your life, Dan? And what are you most excited about right now?
Mm. What I'm doing is talking about this stuff all day, every day. And I'm blessed and incredibly pleased to do so. I really feel like I retired myself this April, and now I just do what I would do anyway, given unlimited funds and time. Um, it's incredible that we have the opportunity to do this. It really just blows my mind daily that we can all just come out online and talk about what we're most experienced in. And that's our livelihood. It's incredible. What I'm most excited for is just expansion of this. I just see this continuing to expand as I continue to show up. I'll be able to reach more people and receive more of those kinds of messages that we all love to receive of, hey, read your thing and it changed everything for me. I tried this practice and it just completely blew me open, and those messages that we love to receive. So just looking forward to expansion. I really don't feel like I need to change very much. Just need to keep showing up and talking about this stuff. There will be other ways of packaging services and products. I've yet to actually productize, so that's going to be interesting when the time comes. But really, it's kind of all the same thing. The packaging part has not come naturally to me. Um, I would have much rather been able to come out here and actually put something more like journal entries out online and not have to think about packaging. Maybe many creators would agree with me. It would certainly be easier, but more and more I understand why it's important. But the fundamental knowledge that I have to share will never change at this point. All I ever really want to say to people is rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. It's just the best possible thing that I could say to someone. And yet there are then all of these levels of why that might be difficult for someone, or why they may experience it as difficult. And that's where the work is to be done.
I love that. You're a great inspiration, I think, in the way that you approach your creation, the way that you help people, the way that you share your story, the vivid detail that you go into about trying times in your life and how you overcame them. And even just speaking to you today, we've had a couple conversations before this, but getting to see you and see how you actually embody that peace and that presence uh, helps me to do the same myself, because I see that you're so aligned, and it's awesome. I'm really grateful that you came on the show and shared so much with my audience. And I wonder if you have any words of encouragement for people, maybe from a content creation standpoint or just from an awareness standpoint, something that's been top of mind for you lately, top of no mind for you lately, and where people can find you online.
Mm. Sure. Well, let's see if I can bring them together. Awareness doesn't judge. Judgment is something that the thinking mind does. And so, a quick and easy encouragement that I could make to our listeners is see if you can just judge what you're doing 1% less and send it out and see what the analytics say, see what the response is. Be prepared to have stuff that does well and stuff that doesn't, and take it all as data. One of the most enduring pieces of advice that I ever received from the head of training in that Alexander Technique organization was to experiment. He told me one evening in class, he said, Dan, you're so concerned with getting it right. He said, stop trying to get it right and experiment. And that was a profound shift for me back then. It was incredibly freeing to just be able to experiment. And from the vantage point of pure awareness that does not judge, given that judgment is a process of the thinking mind, then we can just sit in that silence, in that space, and just write whatever's on our minds. And maybe then there's a process of packaging that as another step. But to just take the brakes off for a minute and allow for ourselves to create. And indeed, there's many systems that we can all implement for this. Some people like to separate their drafting process. We were talking about this before we hit record, right? Some people like to separate their drafting process from their editing process so that they can just go full stream of consciousness in the beginning and then edit up later. But it was interesting for me to hear that you and I both, brother, we tend to edit as we go. And everyone's got their different process. And indeed, we can experiment with the processes. I think what's important is that we all find what works for us and be prepared for that to shift as we change and grow and learn. So that would be my encouragement to our creative friends. Take the brakes off, see what happens. If anyone wants to talk to me about kind of integrating some of the things that we've been speaking about today into their content creation process, my DMs are open. I'm most active on X at It's Dan Goldfield. You can find my newsletter at dangoldfield.com, and that's where you'll hear about everything I'm doing in the future.
Amazing. Wise words, brother. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, brother. I appreciate you too.